Commander Zixthala's first glimpse of humans came through the static-filled emergency transmission that crackled across her ship's communication array 3 cycles ago. The voice was rough, strangely melodic in its desperation, speaking in the crude pigeon trade language most species used for basic communication. "This is Captain Sarah Mitchell of the UES Defiance. We're taking heavy casualties. Repeat, heavy casualties. The Void Hunters have broken through our outer perimeter. We're falling back to secondary positions, but we're not running. Do you copy?" "We are not running." Zixthala had paused in her daily combat meditation, her 4 primary arms still locked in the traditional warrior stance, while her secondary appendages manipulated the communication controls. The message made no logical sense. No species fell back without running when facing the Void Hunters. It was impossible. The Hunters were death incarnate, creatures that had evolved beyond the need for planets or stars, feeding instead on the life force of entire civilizations. When they appeared in a system, every intelligent species did the same thing: evacuate immediately or face complete annihilation. Scanning for verification, her tactical officer, Sub-Commander Veltar, had reported his crystalline carapace shifting colors to indicate confusion. "Commander, the transmission appears authentic. The human's fleet signature matches our database records, but there's something unusual. Report. Their ships are not retreating. They're maintaining formation around the 3rd planet. It appears they're actually engaging the Hunters in direct combat." Zixthala had felt her internal temperature drop several degrees, an involuntary response her people had evolved to prevent system overload during extreme stress. In her 2 centuries of life, she had seen the aftermath of Hunter attacks on dozens of worlds. She had never once encountered a species foolish enough to stand and fight. "Set course for the human system," she had ordered, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that indicated deep curiosity. Maximum velocity. The Kethmaran 3rd Battle Fleet had arrived in the Sol-adjacent system designated as Kepler 442 to find something that challenged every assumption they held about warfare, survival, and the fundamental nature of intelligent life. The humans were not just fighting the Void Hunters. They were winning. Not in the sense that any sane military strategist would define victory. Their casualties were horrendous. Nearly 40% of their fleet had been destroyed or severely damaged. Their defensive installations on the planet's surface were in ruins. By any reasonable metric, they were facing complete defeat within hours. But they kept fighting. Zixthala watched from her flagship's observation deck as human vessels, many of them obviously civilian craft hastily converted for combat, threw themselves directly into Hunter formations with a reckless abandon that bordered on insanity. She watched human fighters, their pilots certainly aware they were flying suicide missions, ram their small craft directly into Hunter bioships 10 times their size. She watched human ground forces hold positions that any other species would have abandoned after the first casualty wave. "Commander," Veltar reported, his voice tight with disbelief, "we're receiving another transmission from the human forces." "Play it." The voice that emerged from the speakers was different this time, younger, crackling with interference and what sounded like weapons fire in the background. "To any alien vessels observing this engagement, be advised, we don't know how to quit. If you're here to help, we could use it. If you're here to watch, you're about to see something special. If you're here for any other reason, you picked the wrong fight." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the static hiss of damaged communication equipment. Zixthala found herself studying the tactical display with new eyes. The humans weren't just fighting desperately, they were fighting smart. Their seemingly random sacrificial attacks were actually carefully coordinated strikes designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Hunter bioarmor. Their ground forces weren't holding impossible positions through mindless bravery alone. They were using the terrain in ways that maximized their defensive capabilities while minimizing their exposure to Hunter energy weapons. They were losing, but they were making the Hunters pay for every meter of ground in ways that Zixthala had never seen before. "Sub-Commander Veltar," she said finally, her voice carrying the deep resonance that indicated a command decision of highest importance. "Signal the fleet." "We're entering the combat zone." "Commander, our standing orders are to observe and report only." "The High Command was very specific about—" "The High Command has never seen anything like this," Zixthala interrupted, her secondary arms already activating the ship's combat systems. "Signal all vessels. Full combat readiness." "We're going to learn what these humans know about fighting the impossible." The next several hours changed everything Zixthala thought she knew about warfare. Her fleet's intervention turned the tide of the battle, but not in the way she had expected. The Kethmarian vessels were individually superior to anything the humans fielded. Faster, more heavily armed, better shielded. But the humans didn't fight like individuals. They fought like a single organism, with 10,000 minds and one unbreakable will. When Keth Moran's ships took damage, they followed standard protocol. Withdraw to safe distance, assess damage, proceed with appropriate caution. When human ships took damage, they did something that defied all military logic. They fought harder. Zixthala watched in fascination and growing horror as human vessels with hull breaches and failing life support systems continued to engage Hunter forces at point-blank range, their crews somehow maintaining peak combat effectiveness even while their ships were literally falling apart around them. The real revelation came when Zixthala received a direct communication request from the human ground commander. The face that appeared on her screen was unlike anything in her species' database of known intelligent life forms. No exoskeleton, no protective carapace, no natural armor of any kind, just soft pink skin, 2 eyes instead of the more efficient cluster arrangement most species had evolved, and facial features that seemed designed more for communication than survival. Commander Zixthala, the human said, somehow managing to pronounce her name correctly despite having vocal cords that seemed woefully inadequate for proper speech. This is Colonel James Harrison, commanding the defense of New Angeles Colony. I understand your people are warriors. We could use warriors right about now. My forces are already engaged, Colonel Harrison. We are providing fire support to your orbital defense network. The human's face did something strange. The corners of his mouth curved upward in what her database identified as a smile, though the expression seemed to carry emotional weight far beyond simple pleasure. That's not what I'm talking about, Commander. The hunters are about to make their final push. They're sending ground forces to the colony itself. 20,000 civilians down there, including children. My Marines can hold them off for a while, but we're going to need help. Real help. The kind that happens when warriors fight together instead of just fighting in the same place. Zixthala felt her internal temperature fluctuate again, but this time it wasn't from stress. It was from something she couldn't quite identify, something that made her want to see these impossible creatures up close, to understand how they could face certain death with expressions that suggested they were looking forward to it. You're asking me to commit ground forces to a surface engagement against void hunters. I'm asking you to stand with us. There's a difference. 3 hours later, Zixthala found herself in a dropship, heading toward the surface of Kepler. 442b, accompanied by 200 of her finest warriors and absolutely no idea what she was getting herself into. The human colony of New Angeles was a sprawling complex of prefabricated structures and defensive installations built into the side of a mountain range. It should have been impregnable. It should have been able to hold off hunter ground forces for cycles. But as her dropship touched down in the colony's central courtyard, Zixthala realized that the humans had built their defenses around a completely different philosophy than any species she had encountered. They hadn't built their colony to be impregnable. They had built it to be a place worth dying for. The humans who greeted her arrival looked exactly as fragile as she had expected. No natural weapons, no protective armor beyond what they had manufactured, no physical capabilities that would give them any advantage in direct combat with species that had evolved for warfare. But there was something in their eyes, something in the way they moved and spoke and prepared for battle that made Zixthala's combat instincts scream warnings she didn't understand. Lieutenant Marcus Chen was among the humans waiting for her in the colony's command center, and when he extended his hand toward her in the bizarre human greeting ritual called a handshake, Zixthala felt her first real glimpse of what she would later recognize as terror. Not fear of the hunters, not concern about the tactical situation, but something deeper and more disturbing. She was afraid of what she might become if she fought beside these creatures. The human's hand was soft, unarmored, vulnerable to the slightest pressure from her crystalline appendages, but when their hands touched, Zixthala felt something pass between them that had nothing to do with physical contact and everything to do with the strange energy she could see burning in his eyes. "Welcome to New Angeles, Commander," Chen said, his voice carrying undertones of grim humor that shouldn't have been possible under the circumstances. "Hope you're ready for a real fight." Outside the command center, the first wave of hunter bioforms were beginning their assault on the colony's outer perimeter. Inside, Zixthala looked around at the collection of humans and aliens who were preparing to face impossible odds together, and realized that her understanding of warfare was about to be completely destroyed. She just didn't realize yet that her understanding of herself was going to be destroyed along with it. The first hunter assault wave hit the colony's perimeter defenses at 0347 local time, and Zixthala learned her first lesson about fighting alongside humans. They didn't just defend positions, they transformed them into extensions of their own will. She had taken position alongside Lieutenant Chen and a squad of human Marines in Defense Point Alpha, a reinforced bunker complex that overlooked the main approach to the colony. The position was tactically sound by any military standard, offering excellent fields of fire and multiple fallback routes. But as the hunters began their approach, Zixtala realized that the humans had done something to the fortification that went beyond simple military engineering. They had made it personal. "That's Sergeant Rodriguez's garden," Chen said, pointing to a small patch of cultivated ground between their position and the enemy approach route. The area was filled with colorful flowering plants that seemed completely out of place on a frontier colony world. "She's been working on it for 3 years. Says it reminds her of home." Zixtala's compound eyes focused on the garden with professional interest. From a tactical standpoint, it was a liability. The raised flower beds would provide cover for advancing enemy forces. From a strategic standpoint, it was meaningless decoration that served no defensive purpose. From a human standpoint, she was beginning to understand it was something else entirely. "The hunters will use it for concealment," she observed, her secondary arms automatically checking her plasma rifle's charge status. "Yeah, they'll try," Chen replied, and there was something in his voice that made Zixtala's threat assessment systems activate without conscious input. "That's why we mined it." The first hunter bioforms came into view as the pre-dawn darkness began to fade. They moved with the fluid, deadly grace that had made them the terror of 100 star systems. Massive serpentine creatures with armored hides and energy projectors that could punch through ship armor. Each one stood nearly 4 meters tall and possessed enough raw destructive power to level a city block. They advanced in perfect formation, their movements coordinated by the hive intelligence that made them nearly impossible to outmaneuver. Zixtala had fought hunters before, always from the safety of a starship or heavily fortified position, always as part of an organized retreat that minimized contact with the enemy. She had never been in a position where retreat wasn't an option, where the only choice was to stand and fight until either the enemy was destroyed or she was. The humans apparently had never considered any other option. "Contact front," came Rodriguez's voice over the communication network, calm and professional despite the approaching death. "Estimate 40 bioforms, advancing in standard hunter formation, weapons free in 30 seconds. Zixtala raised her plasma rifle, her targeting systems automatically calculating range and wind compensation. Beside her, Chen was making similar preparations with his primitive chemical projectile weapon, but she noticed something strange about his movements. He wasn't just preparing to fight, he was preparing to win. "You seem confident," she observed, her voice modulated to indicate curiosity rather than criticism. Chen glanced at her, and she saw that same disturbing expression she had noticed in the command center. Not the grim determination of a soldier preparing to die well, but something that looked almost like anticipation. "Commander, in about 2 minutes you're going to see why every species in the galaxy has the wrong idea about humans." The hunters reached the edge of Rodriguez's garden. What happened next challenged every assumption Zixtala had made about warfare, tactics, and the fundamental nature of intelligent behavior. The humans didn't simply open fire on the advancing enemy forces. They didn't execute a textbook defensive engagement designed to maximize enemy casualties while preserving their own forces. Instead, they did something that made Zixtala's combat computers temporarily malfunction from sheer incomprehension. They turned the entire battlefield into a weapon. The mines concealed among the flowering plants weren't standard explosive devices. They were shaped charges specifically designed to channel the blast upward and outward, turning the garden soil into a horizontal rain of high-velocity projectiles. But that was just the beginning. Hidden beneath decorative rock formations were automated plasma turrets that rose from concealment the moment the first hunter stepped into the kill zone. Concealed in the walls of nearby buildings were rocket launchers operated by civilians who had volunteered to stay behind. The entire colony, Zixtala realized with growing amazement, had been transformed into a single integrated weapons system operated by every man, woman, and child who called New Angeles home. But even that wasn't the most disturbing revelation. The most disturbing revelation was watching the humans operate their improvised death trap with obvious, genuine joy. "Rodriguez, you magnificent crazy person." Chen laughed into his communicator as the first wave of explosions tore through the hunter formation. "Your flowers are beautiful. Just wait until you see the roses," came the sergeant's reply, and Zixtala heard something in the woman's voice that made her species equivalent of blood run cold. It was the sound of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. The hunter bioforms that survived the initial explosions regrouped with mechanical precision, their hive intelligence rapidly adapting to the unexpected tactical situation. They began advancing again, but this time they moved with the cautious precision of predators who had encountered prey that might bite back. It was exactly the wrong approach to use against humans, and Zixtala began to understand why. Humans, she realized, became more dangerous when their enemies became cautious. Second wave incoming, Chen reported, settling his weapon into a firing position with practiced ease. Commander, I hope you're ready to see something your military academies never taught you. The remaining hunters advanced with textbook tactical precision, using cover and concealment to minimize their exposure while maintaining coordinated fields of fire. It was exactly the approach that had allowed them to overrun every other species they had encountered. It should have been devastatingly effective. Instead, it played directly into the human strengths. Where other species saw the hunter's tactical adaptation as a sign of superior intelligence, the humans saw it as predictability. Where other species tried to match the hunter's technical precision, the humans used their own apparent randomness as a weapon. Where other species retreated when faced with superior enemy capabilities, the humans doubled down on their own particular brand of organized insanity. Chen opened fire with his chemical projectile weapon, but instead of aiming for center mass or other high-probability targets, he was deliberately targeting the hunter's sensory organs, not to kill them, but to blind them. Other Marines followed suit, their gunfire creating a coordinated pattern of suppression that had nothing to do with inflicting casualties, and everything to do with controlling the enemy's perception of the battlefield. Now watch, Chen said, his voice carrying a tone that Zixtala was beginning to recognize as uniquely human, the sound of someone about to do something that no sane creature would consider. The Marines stopped firing. For exactly 3 seconds, the battlefield fell silent except for the sound of hunter bioforms advancing through the smoke and debris. Then Chen threw something that looked like a small metallic sphere directly into the center of the enemy formation, and Zixtala's threat assessment systems went completely offline. It wasn't a grenade. It wasn't an explosive device of any kind. It was a communications beacon programmed to emit the same frequency signature as a Hunter Hive intelligence node. The enemy bioform, suddenly convinced that one of their own command organisms was located in the middle of their formation, converged on the beacon with the same mechanical precision they used for everything else. In their hive-minded determination to protect what they believed was a vital command asset, they clustered together in perfect formation, creating exactly the target profile the humans had been waiting for. Rodriguez triggered the second wave of explosives. The shaped charges hidden beneath the colony's decorative pathways had been positioned and timed to create a coordinated blast pattern that would channel the explosion upward through the exact space where bunched-up hunter forces would be most vulnerable. Every piece of shrapnel, every pressure wave, every fragment of superheated debris had been calculated to maximize damage against enemies who had been tricked into optimal target formation. It was the most complex, most sophisticated, most utterly brilliant tactical maneuver Zixtala had ever witnessed. It was also completely insane. How did you know they would respond to the beacon? She asked, her voice systems automatically modulating to indicate deep respect mixed with profound confusion. Chen reloaded his weapon with movements that suggested he had performed this action thousands of times under similar circumstances. We didn't know. We hoped. That's the difference between fighting to survive and fighting to win. Survival is about minimizing risk. Victory is about maximizing opportunity. The remaining hunter bioforms, reduced to perhaps a dozen individuals from an original force of 40, began a tactical withdrawal toward predetermined rally points. It was standard hunter doctrine when faced with unexpected resistance. Regroup, reassess, return with greater force. Against any other species, it would have been the beginning of a successful secondary assault. Against humans, it was exactly the wrong choice. Chen activated his communicator with a gesture that somehow managed to convey both grim satisfaction and anticipation of greater things to come. All units, this is Alpha Defense. Primary assault has been repelled. Enemy forces are withdrawing to Rally Point Charlie. Execute Phase 2. Zixtala's combat computers finally came back online, and she immediately wished they hadn't. The tactical display showed her something that challenged her fundamental understanding of military logic. The humans weren't content to have successfully defended their position. They weren't satisfied with having inflicted heavy casualties on an enemy force that had previously been considered unstoppable. They were going to pursue the retreating hunters and finish them off. That's tactically unsound, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that indicated both professional concern and species-level confusion. Standard doctrine calls for consolidating defensive positions and preparing for renewed assault. Pursuing a retreating enemy into unknown terrain violates every principle of commander, Chen interrupted, and his expression carried something that Zixtala would later recognize as the most terrifying thing about humans: infinite patience combined with absolute certainty. Has standard doctrine ever defeated the hunters? The question hung in the air between them like an armed explosive device. Because, of course, it hadn't. Standard doctrine called for evacuation when hunters appeared in a system. Standard doctrine assumed that direct engagement with hunter forces was suicide. Standard doctrine had never even considered the possibility that the hunters could be defeated in ground combat. Standard doctrine, Zixthala realized with growing alarm, might be completely wrong about everything. No, she said finally. Standard doctrine has never defeated the hunters. Chen's smile returned, and this time Zixthala understood exactly why it was so disturbing. It wasn't the expression of someone who was confident of victory. It was the expression of someone who had already won, who was just waiting for the universe to catch up with that reality. Then maybe it's time to try something different, he said, checking his weapon one final time before standing up. You coming, Commander? We've got a war to win. As Zixthala followed the human Marines out of their defensive position and into the pre-dawn darkness of an alien world, pursuing enemies that had never been successfully defeated in ground combat, she realized that everything she thought she knew about warfare was about to be proven wrong. She also realized that she was looking forward to it. Following the human Marines through the alien terrain of Kepler, 442b in the pre-dawn darkness, Zixthala began to understand that she hadn't just joined a pursuit force. She had become part of something that her species' language had no words for. The Kethmoran military doctrine included 17 different categories of combat operations, from defensive siege warfare to orbital bombardment campaigns. Each category had specific protocols, established procedures, and predictable outcomes based on force ratios and tactical considerations. What the humans were doing didn't fit into any of those categories because it wasn't really warfare at all. It was hunting. Stay low and watch your footing, Chen whispered as they moved through a ravine that cut between two rocky ridges. The hunters have excellent seismic detection, but they're not used to prey that actively stalks them. Zixthala's secondary visual sensors automatically adjusted to the low-light conditions, giving her a clear view of the terrain ahead. The retreating hunter bioforms had left an obvious trail through the sandy soil, deep furrows where their massive forms had moved, trace chemical signatures from their biological systems, even fragments of their armored hide caught on rocky outcroppings. Following them would have been simple enough for any competent tracker. But the humans weren't just following the trail. They were analyzing it, interpreting it, using it to predict what the hunters would do next, in ways that made Zixthala's tactical computers seem primitive by comparison. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of their formation pattern? Chen spoke into his communicator, his voice barely above a whisper. They're moving in standard retreat formation 7, came the sergeant's reply from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Wounded individuals in the center. Heaviest fighters providing rear guard, advanced scouts maintaining perimeter security. Textbook hunter doctrine. Which means they're heading for the old mining complex about 2 kilometers northeast of here. Only defensible position in this terrain that matches their formation requirements. They'll set up a standard siege perimeter and wait for reinforcement from the orbital forces. Shen made a sound that Zixthala's translation software identified as human laughter, though it carried undertones that suggested something far more complex than simple amusement. Perfect. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Zixthala felt her internal temperature fluctuate again. In Kethmoran military theory, an enemy who followed predictable patterns was vulnerable but not necessarily easy to defeat. Predictability allowed for tactical planning, but it didn't automatically confer advantage unless you possessed superior force or better position. The human Marines were outnumbered, operating in unfamiliar terrain and pursuing an enemy that had evolved specifically for this type of combat. By any rational analysis, they were walking into a trap that would result in their complete destruction. The fact that they seemed to be looking forward to it was beginning to seriously disturb Zixthala's understanding of rational behavior. Lieutenant Chen, she said, modulating her voice to the frequency range that humans seem to find most comfortable, what is your tactical objective for this operation? Chen paused in his movement, turning to look at her with an expression that seemed to combine genuine puzzlement with patient explanation. Our objective is to eliminate the enemy force before they can establish defensive positions and call for reinforcement. That much I understand. But your approach seems to assume that we can successfully assault a fortified position held by superior numbers of enemy forces with better individual combat capabilities. The probability calculations don't support a successful outcome. Commander, Chen said, and his voice carried something that Zixthala was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. The sound of someone explaining something that was obviously true, but somehow impossible to believe. You're thinking like a Kethmoran. You need to think like a human. I don't understand the distinction. Chen resumed, moving forward, and Zixthala found herself following automatically while her conscious mind tried to process what he was saying. Around them, the other Marines moved with a fluid coordination that suggested they had done this type of operation many times before, under circumstances that were probably just as impossible as the current ones. Akef Moran looks at this situation and sees a tactical problem, Chen continued, his voice remaining barely audible despite the fact that he was apparently lecturing on military philosophy while conducting a combat patrol. Superior enemy numbers, better individual capabilities, defensive advantage. How do we minimize our losses while maximizing enemy casualties? How do we achieve our objective with acceptable risk? Zixthala found herself nodding in agreement, her primary appendages automatically making the gesture that indicated understanding and approval. That was exactly how she had been trained to analyze tactical situations. A human looks at this situation and sees an opportunity, Chen said, and there was something in his voice that made every one of Zixthala's threat assessment systems activate simultaneously. The hunters are doing exactly what their nature tells them to do. They're following their instincts, their training, their evolutionary programming. They're being predictable. Predictable can still be dangerous. Predictable can be controlled. They crested a small ridge, and Zixthala got her first clear view of the abandoned mining complex that the hunters had chosen for their defensive position. It was exactly what Chen and Rodriguez had predicted, a collection of reinforced structures built into the side of a mountain, with clear fields of fire and multiple defensive choke points. The hunter bioforms had already begun establishing their perimeter, using their natural abilities to create organic fortifications that would be nearly impossible to breach with conventional assault tactics. It should have been impregnable. Any sane military force would have taken one look at the position and decided to call for orbital bombardment or heavy artillery support. The human Marines began setting up what appeared to be a picnic. "What are you doing?" Zixthala asked, watching in fascination as Rodriguez unpacked something that looked like a portable cooking device from her equipment pack. "Making coffee," Rodriguez replied, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "And waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For them to get comfortable." Zixthala's combat computers ran through 17 different tactical scenarios, trying to find one that made sense of what she was observing. The humans had pursued a numerically superior enemy force to a heavily fortified position, and now they were apparently planning to have a meal while waiting for something to happen. It violated every principle of military logic she had ever learned. It also, she was beginning to suspect, violated every assumption the hunters had made about their pursuers. Chen activated a small device that projected a three-dimensional map of the mining complex and surrounding terrain. The image showed the hunter defensive positions in remarkable detail, including patrol patterns, weapon placements, and what appeared to be communication nodes. "How did you acquire this intelligence?" Zixthala asked, studying the display with professional interest. "We didn't acquire it," Chen replied, making adjustments to the display with casual precision. "We created it." "I don't understand." Rodriguez looked up from her coffee preparation, and Zixthala saw the same disturbing expression she had noticed on Chen's face, the look of someone who was about to explain something that should have been impossible. "Commander, what do you know about human psychology?" "Very little. My species doesn't typically engage in psychological warfare." "Well, here's the thing about psychology," Rodriguez continued, returning her attention to the coffee maker. "It works both ways. You can use it to understand your enemy's behavior, or you can use it to control your enemy's behavior. We've been doing both since we first made contact with the hunters." Chen pointed to specific locations on the tactical display, highlighting patrol routes and defensive positions. "Every action we've taken since the initial assault has been designed to reinforce the hunters' preconceptions about how their enemies behave. We retreated when they expected retreat. We defended when they expected defense. We pursued when they expected pursuit. We've been completely predictable. That seems counterproductive. It would be if we were actually doing what they think we're doing," Chen said, and his smile returned with an intensity that made Zixthala's threat assessment systems register him as the most dangerous individual in the immediate area. "But we're not. Everything they think they know about our tactical doctrine is wrong. Everything they think they can predict about our next move is based on false information. And everything they're doing to prepare for our assault is actually helping us win." The coffee finished brewing with a soft chime, and Rodriguez poured 3 cups of the dark liquid. She offered one to Zixthala, who accepted it more out of curiosity than thirst. The taste was bitter but oddly pleasant, with complex flavors that seemed to change as she drank. "The hunters are setting up a classic defensive perimeter," Rodriguez explained, settling back against a convenient rock formation. Overlapping fields of fire, mutually supporting positions, clear retreat routes to fallback positions, perfect doctrine for defending against a frontal assault by numerically inferior forces. Which is exactly what they're facing. No, Chen said, and there was something in his voice that made Zixthala set down her coffee cup and pay very careful attention. That's what they think they're facing. What they're actually facing is something that doesn't exist in their tactical database. He made another adjustment to the tactical display, and suddenly Zixthala could see additional elements that hadn't been visible before. Hidden approach routes through underground mining tunnels. Concealed weapons positions that the humans had apparently established weeks ago. Supply caches and communication relays that turned the entire area into an integrated combat system controlled by the human forces. "You've been planning this engagement for some time," she observed, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that indicated deep respect mixed with growing alarm. "We've been planning this engagement since the moment we detected the first Hunter scout ships entering the system," Chen replied. "Everything that's happened today, including your arrival with the Kethmoran fleet, has been part of our tactical framework." Zixthala felt her internal temperature drop several degrees as the implications of what Chen was saying penetrated her conscious awareness. The humans hadn't just been defending their colony from an unexpected attack. They had deliberately engineered the entire tactical situation, turning their own world into a weapon designed specifically to destroy Hunter forces. They had used themselves as bait. "The orbital engagement," she said slowly, her voice systems automatically modulating to indicate dawning comprehension. "Your fleet's defensive action against the Hunter bioships. That wasn't desperate resistance. That was misdirection. The Hunters had to believe they were winning," Rodriguez confirmed, refilling her coffee cup with movements that suggested she was enjoying herself immensely. "They had to commit to a ground assault. They had to follow their standard tactical doctrine. They had to do exactly what their nature told them to do. And now they're trapped." Chen's smile became something that would have given nightmares to any species capable of experiencing them. "Now they're exactly where we want them to be, doing exactly what we want them to do, facing exactly the kind of opposition they're least prepared to handle." The tactical display updated again, showing new information that made Zixthala's combat computers temporarily shut down from sheer processing overload. The humans hadn't just prepared one trap for the Hunter forces. They had prepared dozens of them, all integrated into a single vast system that turned the entire planet into a weapon designed to exploit every known weakness in Hunter psychology and tactical doctrine. "How is this possible?" she asked, her voice barely functioning as her conscious mind tried to process the scope of what she was seeing. "Commander," Chen said, standing up and checking his weapon with movements that indicated someone who was about to go to work, "this is what humans do. We don't just fight wars." In the distance, the first explosions began to light up the pre-dawn sky as the other elements of the human battle plan activated with clockwork precision. The Hunter defensive position, which had seemed impregnable moments before, began to collapse as coordinated attacks struck from directions that shouldn't have been possible. "Time to go," Rodriguez said, shouldering her equipment pack with practiced efficiency. "Don't want to miss the finale." As Zixthala followed the human marines toward what should have been their deaths, she realized that her understanding of warfare had been completely wrong. Humans didn't fight to win individual battles. They fought to rewrite the fundamental rules of conflict itself. And they were very, very good at it. The assault on the Hunter position began at exactly 0627 local time, and within the first 30 seconds, Zixthala understood why every species in the galaxy feared humans more than they feared the Void Hunters themselves. The Hunters, trapped in their supposedly impregnable defensive position, found themselves under attack from 17 different directions simultaneously. But it wasn't the coordinated nature of the assault that made Zixthala's threat assessment systems register maximum danger ratings. It was the fact that each individual attack seemed designed not to destroy the enemy, but to force them into specific behavioral patterns that served the humans' greater tactical purpose. "Underground teams are in position," came a voice over Chen's communicator. Someone Zixthala didn't recognize, speaking with the calm professionalism that she was beginning to associate with human military operations. "Charges are set on primary support structures. Ready to execute on your command." "Negative," Chen replied, his voice carrying the same disturbing patience she had noticed before. "Wait for secondary confirmation. They need to move first." Zixthala crouched beside Chen behind a rocky outcropping that provided excellent observation of the Hunter position while keeping them concealed from enemy sensors. Around them, other human marines maintained similar positions, their weapons trained on specific targets with mechanical precision. but none of them were firing. "Why are we waiting?" she asked, her secondary appendages automatically checking her plasma rifle's charge status for the third time in as many minutes. "Because shooting them isn't the objective," Chen replied, making minute adjustments to his weapon's targeting system. "The objective is making them do what we need them to do." As if responding to his words, the hunter bioforms within the defensive perimeter began to move. Their hive intelligence had detected the human forces surrounding their position, and they were implementing Standard Defensive Protocol 12, consolidate forces at primary strongpoints, establish overlapping fields of fire, prepare for coordinated breakthrough assault. It was exactly what the humans had been waiting for. "Now," Chen said quietly into his communicator, "the explosions that followed weren't designed to kill the hunters. They were designed to channel them. The underground charges detonated in a carefully timed sequence that collapsed specific structures while leaving others intact, creating corridors of movement that led the hunter forces exactly where the humans wanted them to go. Support beams fell to block certain routes while leaving others suspiciously clear. Debris patterns formed natural choke points that would force the hunters to bunch up in predictable formations. "Hurting," Zixthala said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "You're hurting them like domestic animals." "Humans have been hurting things for over 10,000 years. Rodriguez's voice came over the communication network, carrying undertones of grim satisfaction. "We're very good at it." The hunter bioforms, responding to their evolutionary programming and hive intelligence protocols, moved through the carefully prepared corridors exactly as the humans had predicted. Their superior individual combat capabilities meant nothing when they were being manipulated at the level of basic behavioral psychology. Their advanced tactical doctrine became a liability when every response they had been programmed to make served their enemy's strategic objectives. "Team 3, execute Phase 7, Chen ordered, his voice maintaining the same calm professionalism despite the fact that he was orchestrating one of the most complex military operations Zixthala had ever witnessed. What happened next challenged everything she thought she knew about the relationship between individual capability and collective effectiveness. A single human marine, carrying nothing more sophisticated than a chemical projectile weapon and some basic demolition equipment, infiltrated a position defended by 3 hunter bioforms, each one capable of destroying a small building with their natural weapons. The marine didn't engage them in direct combat. Instead, she used their own defensive instincts against them, creating a series of apparent threats that forced them to reposition themselves in ways that left them vulnerable to coordinated fire from their concealed comrades. Within minutes, all 3 hunters had been eliminated without the marine firing a single shot. "How is this possible?" Zixthala asked, her voice systems unable to maintain proper modulation as she tried to process what she was seeing. "Humans don't think in terms of individual versus individual," Chen explained, never taking his eyes off the tactical display. "We think in terms of system versus system. Every hunter is individually superior to any human in direct combat, but they're all parts of the same system. If you can understand the system, you can control it." The assault continued with mechanical precision, each phase flowing seamlessly into the next as the human forces dismantled the hunter defensive position piece by piece. But it wasn't the tactical brilliance that disturbed Zixthala most deeply. It was the realization that the humans were enjoying themselves. Not in the way that warriors of her own species enjoyed combat. The satisfaction of testing one's skills against a worthy opponent. The pride in demonstrating superior training and equipment. The humans were experiencing something that Zixthala's language had no words for. Something that combined professional satisfaction with genuine pleasure in ways that suggested they had found their natural element. "Chen," Rodriguez's voice came over the communicator, carrying tones that indicated both amusement and anticipation. "The big one is making his move." Through her enhanced visual sensors, Zixthala could see what Rodriguez was referring to. The largest of the hunter bioforms, clearly the command organism for this particular group, was beginning a coordinated breakout attempt. It was gathering the surviving hunters into a tight formation and preparing to punch through what it had identified as the weakest point in the human perimeter. It was perfect hunter doctrine, executed with flawless precision and overwhelming force. Against any other species, it would have been devastatingly effective. Against humans, it was exactly what they had been waiting for. "All teams, stand by for final phase," Chen said, and there was something in his voice that made Zixthala's combat instincts scream warnings she didn't understand. "Remember, we want them intact." "Intact?" Zixthala's voice systems automatically registered confusion and concern. "You're planning to capture them?" Chen turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was completely serious. No hint of that disturbing human smile, no indication of the patient amusement she had come to associate with his voice, just cold professional focus that made her realize she had never actually seen him in full combat mode before. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying harmonic undertones that her translation systems interpreted as absolute certainty. "We're not planning to capture them. We're planning to recruit them." The final phase of the human assault began with something that should have been impossible. Instead of attacking the hunter breakout formation, the human forces opened a corridor for them. Not a trap, not a killing zone, but an actual escape route that would allow the surviving hunters to retreat from the battlefield with minimal casualties. The Hunter Command organism, faced with an unexpected opportunity to preserve its forces, did exactly what its programming told it to do. It led its remaining bioforms through the apparent gap in the human perimeter, moving with coordinated precision toward what looked like safety. What it found instead was something that no hunter hive intelligence had ever encountered before. The escape corridor led to a prepared position where the humans had set up what appeared to be a communication array. Not weapons, not defensive fortifications, but sophisticated equipment designed for long-range transmission and real-time translation between different biological communication systems. Standing beside the array was a human Zixthala didn't recognize, an older male wearing the insignia of a senior commander, flanked by individuals from a dozen different species, including, she realized with shock, 2 other Kethmoran warriors who must have arrived with reinforcement forces. "I am Admiral Marcus Webb, commanding the Allied Defense Force," the human said, his voice being simultaneously translated into hunter biological communication frequencies and broadcast directly to the approaching bioforms. "I have a proposition for you." The Hunter Command organism, faced with a situation that had no precedent in its evolutionary programming, did the only thing it could do. It stopped, maintaining its defensive formation while its hive intelligence tried to process this unexpected development. "Your species has spent millennia perfecting the art of destroying other civilizations," Webb continued, his voice carrying the same calm professionalism that Zixthala had observed in every human she had encountered. "You're very good at it, but you've never encountered a species that's better at it than you are." The implications of what Webb was saying hit Zixthala like a plasma bolt to the central processing cluster. The humans hadn't been defending themselves from a hunter attack. They had been demonstrating their capabilities to a potential ally. "We're offering you a choice," Webb said, gesturing to the mixed species group standing beside him. "Continue following your current evolutionary programming and face extinction when you encounter species that have learned to fight the way we do. Or join us and learn what warfare looks like when it's practiced by beings who have made it into an art form." The Hunter Command organism's response came through the communication array as a series of complex bioelectrical patterns that the human translation systems converted into audible language. "Your proposal assumes we would be willing to ally ourselves with inferior beings." Webb's expression didn't change, but something in the air around him seemed to shift in ways that made every combat-capable individual in the immediate area automatically check their weapon status. "We just demonstrated that we can predict, manipulate, and control every aspect of your tactical doctrine without engaging you in direct combat. We turned your own strengths into weaknesses and used your own instincts to defeat you. In what universe does that make us inferior?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of distant explosions as other elements of the human battle plan continued to execute with mechanical precision. Around the galaxy, Zixthala realized, similar demonstrations were probably taking place as human forces engaged hunter fleets in ways that challenged everything both species thought they knew about warfare. "What are you asking of us?" the Hunter Command organism finally transmitted. "Learn," Webb replied, and his voice carried something that Zixthala was beginning to recognize as the most dangerous thing about humans: infinite patience combined with absolute conviction. Learn to fight beside us instead of against us. Learn to use your capabilities as part of something greater than individual survival. Learn what it means to be part of a civilization that doesn't just destroy its enemies, but transforms them into allies. Chen moved closer to Zixthala, his weapon lowered but still ready, his expression carrying the same patient confidence she had observed throughout the entire engagement. "This is what humans do, Commander. We don't just win wars, we end them, permanently." As the Hunter Command organism considered the humans' proposal, surrounded by the wreckage of its own tactical assumptions and facing the representatives of a dozen species that had somehow learned to work together instead of simply avoiding extinction, Zixthala understood that she was witnessing something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy. The humans weren't just better at warfare than anyone had imagined. They were better at peace. 3 standard cycles after the Battle of New Angeles, Commander Zixtala stood on the observation deck of the joint species vessel Unity's Edge, watching human and hunter forces conduct coordinated training exercises in the space around Kepler 442b. The sight should have been impossible. Everything in her evolutionary programming, her military training, and her personal experience told her that what she was witnessing violated the fundamental laws of biological warfare. Hunters and humans working together, not just cooperating, but genuinely collaborating in ways that amplified both species' natural capabilities while compensating for their individual weaknesses. Hunter bioforms providing overwhelming firepower and nearly indestructible organic armor, human tactical intelligence, directing that power with precision that turned every engagement into a surgical strike against enemy weaknesses. It was the most terrifying thing Zixtala had ever seen. Magnificent, isn't it? Admiral Webb joined her at the observation window, his voice carrying the same calm satisfaction she had learned to associate with humans who were watching their plans unfold exactly as intended. 6 months ago, the Hunters were the most feared force in the galaxy. Now they're the most effective component of the Allied Defense Force. How did you know it would work? Zixtala asked, her voice systems automatically modulating to indicate respectful curiosity mixed with profound unease. Your species had never encountered the Hunters before the attack on this system. How could you predict they would be willing to ally themselves with you? Webb settled into a comfortable position beside the window, his movements carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who had successfully completed an impossible task. Commander, what do you know about human history? My species typically focuses on contemporary military capabilities rather than historical analysis. Then let me tell you a story, Webb said, and there was something in his voice that made Zixtala's threat assessment systems activate despite the fact that they were standing in a safe location surrounded by Allied forces. 10,000 years ago, humans shared their homeworld with another species, wolves. Powerful predators, perfectly adapted for hunting in coordinated packs, capable of bringing down prey many times their size. Zixtala's compound eyes focused on the training exercise outside, where hunter bioforms were executing complex maneuvers under human tactical direction. I assume the humans eventually drove them to extinction. No, Webb replied, and his smile carried something that made every one of Zixtala's survival instincts scream warnings she didn't understand. We made them into dogs. The implications of what Webb was saying penetrated Zixtala's conscious awareness like a slow-acting poison. The humans hadn't just defeated the Hunters in combat. They had identified the psychological and behavioral patterns that made the Hunters effective as a species, and then engineered a social framework that channeled those same patterns toward cooperative rather than destructive ends. The Hunters are predators, Webb continued, his voice carrying the same patient explanation she had heard from Chen and Rodriguez. Their entire evolutionary framework is built around identifying, pursuing, and destroying other life forms. That's not a weakness to be eliminated, it's a strength to be redirected. Through the observation window, Zixtala watched a formation of hunter bioforms execute a coordinated assault on a simulated enemy position. Their movements had the same deadly precision she remembered from the attack on New Angeles, but now the precision was being directed by human tactical intelligence toward objectives that served the greater strategic needs of the Allied Defense Force. You've weaponized their nature, she said, her voice barely functional as her conscious mind tried to process the scope of what the humans had accomplished. We've optimized it, Webb corrected, and there was something in his voice that suggested this distinction was important to him. The Hunters are still doing exactly what their evolutionary programming tells them to do. They're still identifying, pursuing, and destroying other life forms. The only difference is that now they're doing it in service of protecting civilizations instead of consuming them. A new group joined them at the observation window. Rodriguez and Chen, along with several other humans Zixtala didn't recognize, and what appeared to be a hunter communication specialist, its bioelectrical patterns translated through a portable interface device. Commander Zixtala? Chen said, his voice carrying the same disturbing warmth she remembered from their first meeting. I'd like you to meet Aggregate Combat Unit 7. He's been working with our Tactical Planning Division to develop new approaches to multi-species warfare. The Hunters' translated communication came through the interface as a series of precisely modulated tones. The human approach to warfare optimization has increased our operational effectiveness by approximately 400% while reducing resource consumption by 60%. This collaboration represents the most significant evolutionary advancement our species has achieved in 12,000 years. Zixthala found herself staring at the hunter communication specialist with something approaching horror. Not because the creature was inherently frightening. She had faced hunters in combat before, and while they were formidable opponents, they were comprehensible within the framework of normal military threats. What horrified her was the realization that this hunter was genuinely, enthusiastically happy. "You enjoy working with humans," she said, her voice system struggling to maintain proper modulation. "The humans have shown us purposes for our capabilities that we had never considered," the hunter replied, its bioelectrical patterns carrying harmonics that her translation software interpreted as satisfaction and anticipation. "We were designed to be the ultimate predators. The humans have taught us to be the ultimate protectors. The difference is tactically minimal but strategically revolutionary." Rodriguez activated a holographic display that showed the current military situation across several star systems. Where there had once been refugee columns fleeing hunter attacks, there were now joint human-hunter fleets providing protection and humanitarian assistance to dozens of species. Where there had once been devastated worlds marked by the aftermath of hunter-feeding frenzies, there were now thriving colonies protected by integrated defense networks that combined human strategic intelligence with hunter tactical capabilities. "This is what humans do," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the same patient confidence Zixthala had observed during the battle. "We don't just solve problems. We transform them into advantages. But at what cost?" The question escaped Zixthala's vocal systems before she could consciously decide to ask it. "What does this transformation do to the humans themselves? What do you become when you make allies out of the galaxy's most feared predators?" The silence that followed her question was not uncomfortable, but it was profound. Around her, the humans exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations in the span of seconds. The hunter communication specialist's bioelectrical patterns shifted to frequencies that her translation software couldn't interpret. "Commander," Webb said finally, his voice carrying something that Zixthala was beginning to recognize as the most fundamentally human characteristic of all: infinite capacity for self-reflection combined with absolute commitment to chosen principles. "Do you want to see what we become?" Before she could respond, the observation window's display shifted to show her something that challenged every assumption she had made about the relationship between power and responsibility. It was a recording from the Kepler 442 system taken during the immediate aftermath of the battle. But instead of showing the expected scenes of military victory and tactical debriefing, it showed human medical personnel working alongside hunter bioforms to provide emergency care to wounded civilians. Humans, whose own casualties had been severe during the fighting, sharing their medical supplies with members of species they had never encountered before. Hunters, whose evolutionary programming should have compelled them to consume injured life forms, instead using their biological capabilities to synthesize medications and provide physical protection for vulnerable individuals. "This is what we become," Chen said, his voice carrying something that made Zixthala's combat instincts register him as simultaneously the most dangerous and most trustworthy individual she had ever encountered. "We become what we've always been, just more so. And what is that? Human." The recording continued, showing scenes that should have been impossible according to everything Zixthala knew about interspecies relations. Humans and hunters working together to rebuild damaged infrastructure. Children from a dozen different species playing games that had been adapted to accommodate various biological requirements. Scientists from civilizations that had never met before, sharing research and developing technologies that none of them could have created alone. "The terror you're feeling right now," Webb said, his voice carrying the same gentle patience she had observed in every human she had encountered, "that's not fear of what we might do to your species. That's fear of what your species might become, if you truly understood what we're offering." Zixthala found herself looking around at the mixed species group surrounding her, trying to identify the moment when her understanding of the universe had fundamentally shifted. The hunters were still deadly predators, but now their predatory instincts served protective rather than destructive purposes. The humans were still the same soft-skinned, apparently vulnerable creatures she had initially dismissed as tactically insignificant, but now she could see them for what they truly were. They were evolutionary catalysts, capable of identifying the core strengths of any species and creating frameworks that allowed those strengths to serve purposes greater than individual survival. They didn't conquer other species. They transformed them into better versions of themselves. "What are you asking of us?" she said, the question emerging from some deep part of her consciousness that understood the implications of this conversation better than her rational mind. "Nothing you're not already becoming," Rodriguez replied, gesturing toward the ongoing training exercises outside the window. "Your people have been working alongside our forces for 3 cycles now. You've seen how we fight, how we think, how we solve problems that other species consider impossible. The question isn't what we're asking of you. The question is what you're going to do with what you've learned. Zixthala looked out at the joint human hunter Kethmoran fleet, conducting maneuvers with coordinated precision that exceeded anything her species had achieved in its entire military history. She watched crews from dozen different worlds working together with the kind of seamless cooperation that should have taken generations to develop. She observed tactics and strategies being implemented that combined the best elements of multiple species' approaches to warfare while eliminating the weaknesses that had made each individual species vulnerable. And she realized that the terror she felt wasn't about what the humans might do to her people. It was about what her people might become if they truly embraced what the humans were teaching them. "Commander," Webb said, his voice carrying something that sounded almost like an invitation, "would you like to see what the galaxy looks like when every species in it is working together instead of just trying to avoid extinction?" The holographic display shifted one final time, showing her a tactical projection of the known galaxy 5 years in the future. Where there had once been scattered refugee colonies and isolated defensive positions, there were now integrated civilizations spanning entire sectors. Where there had once been species-specific military forces focused primarily on individual survival, there were now combined fleets capable of projecting protective power across interstellar distances. Where there had once been the constant threat of extinction from forces like the Void Hunters, there was now something that Zixthala's language had no words for, but that her consciousness recognized immediately: hope. Genuine, sustainable, species-spanning hope for a future that was better than the present. "This is what humans do," Chen said, his voice carrying the same patient confidence she had observed during the battle, but now she understood what that confidence really represented. "We don't just fight wars, we build futures." As Zixthala stood surrounded by representatives of species that had learned to work together instead of simply avoiding each other's destruction, watching training exercises that prepared them to face challenges that none of them could handle alone, she understood that her initial assessment had been completely wrong. The true terror hadn't struck when she fought shoulder to shoulder with humanity. The true terror had struck when she realized what she could become by fighting shoulder to shoulder with humanity. And the most terrifying part of all was how much she was looking forward to it.